Hey, Center Grace family, so good to be with you again on Wednesday for another installment of a video talking about growing in our affection for God. Now, we're just going to dive right in this week, but as we do, I want to just, think back, reflect back on the last 2 weeks. It would be really easy if we were thinking back about the last 2 weeks' videos for us to, in essence, think that if we're going to grow in affection for God, it's all up to us. Remember that the first week we talked about how we have to be intentional and we also have to be attentive in order to grow in affection for God. And then last week we talked a little bit about how, like on a special event or a special occasion, like an anniversary or a birthday, on those days or in those moments, we think deeply about the person that we're celebrating. And we want to ascribe worth and value to that person, rightly so. And it would be really easy for us after those 2 weeks worth of videos to think that in essence, I kind of have to pull myself up by my bootstraps and I have to just learn how to love God. And in one sense, that couldn't be further from the truth. And let's just clarify how we grow, again, as we're just drilling down deeper and deeper into this topic of how we as disciples grow in affection for God. How does that take place? Now, when I was a kid, my great-grandmother lived in a house that didn't have running water inside. And anytime we would go over as kids, my brother and I, if we wanted a drink, we would have to prime her well pump. So she had a pump outside. I thought about drawing one, but it was horrible. And so I left it alone. But we would have to pour a little bit of water into the top of the pump and then prime the handle a bunch of times. And then finally water would flow out. I want you to think about our love or our affection for God like that well or like that pump, because we have to be primed in order to grow in our love for God. Here's the thing, if you don't remember anything else, this is the thing I want you to remember today, that God is the one who initiates love. God is the one who initiates affection. We don't initiate, we must receive God's love. So we're going to put two things up on the board today and then a kind of a final summary statement as we think through this. But here's what I want you to understand. The first thing is that God's love for us must be remembered or received. That's the most important thing to remember to start, is that God's love for us must be remembered and received. Now, think about some examples biblically where this would just be clear as day in the scriptures. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 7, John writes that love is from God, it's not from us. In verse 10, he makes it all the more clear. He says, we didn't love God first, he loved us, and he gave his son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins, right? So those are two good examples that love, we have to be primed. Just like that pump, you pour something into it, water, before you get something out of it. Just like God's love has to be poured into us before our love for God is going to be able to flow. God's love for us must be received and remembered first. Another way that you can think about this, remember John's nickname that he gave himself in the gospel? I always thought it was really arrogant that John referred to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. But it was that reality, I'm convinced, it was that reality, John reminding himself of his being loved by God, remembering God's love, Jesus' love for him. That's what made him a loving person towards God. And that's what made him even then be willing to go on and say that if we're going to be his true disciples, we're going to have to not only love God, but we're going to have to love one another. John loved that word love. And one of the reasons why he did is because he knew that he was loved of God. So when was the last time that you just sat with that reality? When was the last time that you just sat and received God's love? Maybe you need to read Romans 8, or maybe you need to read 1 John chapter 4 and just reflect on the fact that you are loved of God. But then secondly, that's when our love for God becomes a response. So it's our love for God that becomes a response. And it's not just our love for God, honestly. It is, like I just hinted, it's our love for other people too, because the greatest commandments are to love God and to love our neighbors. But it's only when we are remembering and receiving God's love that then our love for God and others becomes a response. It becomes almost a natural thing, just like that well. When you pour water into it and you prime that pump, it starts to gush out water. So it is that when we're poured into with the love of God, it begins to spill out from us. Another example from the letter of 1 John. In 1 John 4:19, John goes on and he says, in this verse in particular, he says, we love because God first loved us. Again, it becomes a response. Remember that, like when you're a kid and you're at the swimming pool or something like that and you see somebody do a belly flop, nobody has to tell you in that moment that you need to moan. You just know that it hurts, right? It's a natural response. Well, when God's love is being poured into us over the course of time, when we're receiving and remembering God's love for us, our love for God and other people becomes a natural response. It flows out. And so here's what we want to walk away from today. In the end, to be loving, you need to remember that you are loved. Or to say it differently or with slightly a little bit more poetry, I guess, to be loving, you must be loved. You need to remember that you are God's beloved. To be loving, you must be loved. Again, it's a little cheesy, I know, but the reality is still true, right? You are loved of God. And the way that you're going to deepen in your affection for God, it's like priming a pump. You have to let God pour his love into you. And then the natural response is going to be that you're going to grow, you're going to overflow in affection for God and for other people. We love you guys. We'll see you on Sunday.